Thank you. And I wanted him to touch base on that because I'll cover a little bit about that as we go through this. This says 2019. I've got the updated 2023 one in my pocket, but it's not a lot different, and you got copies on these. So, no, this is fine. This is perfectly fine, Dr. Teutsch. It's not that much different. So we're gonna go through this kind of quickly to get you kind of set up for when Adam comes up and goes through some things with you on planning a grazing system, on laying out your farm. There's a few things that I think that are important. Think about laying out your grazing systems. The goal should be even grazing distribution. We talked a lot about that already, but we want to improve grass utilization. Because if we don't, then you got forage that's growing, getting over mature, it becomes less palatable, and they avoid that. We also then want to, in combination, improve our manure distribution, and that's why we talked about those temporary water systems and being able to move those so that where the animals urinate and defecate, you get nutrients kind of spread out.
You're talking about fundamentals of laying out grazing system now? Sure. Or you're talking about nutritional needs?
Well, I don't know, whatever you pulled up.
Okay. So Jeff's also talking about meeting nutritional needs.
Yep.
Is that what we're supposed to be on? Yeah, that's what we're on now.
You don't have that one? I've got it in my pocket. I always come prepared. We flex.
We could be perfect in all that we do, good ability, but we want you to be able to relate to us. So we kind of mess up on purpose a few times.
I just assumed we changed everything up with the rain schedule. That's what I'm going with. Oh, by the way, y'all flunked. Water system did not work. It blew out in multiple places, so it just wasn't one. And I think, in all reality, I think what happened, this was the first year we used silicone on those rubber gaskets. And I think it didn't provide enough resistance under the high pressure that we have at the farm. And that some of you didn't crank those fittings down quite tight enough for the collars to lock in. However, that said, those collars, there are two types of collars for two different diameter pipes. There's a green collar and a white collar. And we may actually have the wrong pipe size for those collars. I'm going to go back out and look.
It's your fault.
The other thing, 2 and 4, not all of your heifers stayed in. Okay? And that is important to think about because remember, cattle are instinctually herd animals. And so we had a group of about 30 heifers and we peeled out those and split them up into 2 paddocks and then said, okay, break your herd dynamics and stay in with that electric fence. Most of them did in that first day, but there were 2 rogues that wanted to get back to the herd. So when you go out this afternoon to evaluate your pastures, I want you to remember that. So paddocks 2 and 4, one of them jumped out at some point in time last night.
Okay, now let's restart. Jeff, please talk to us on meeting nutritional needs.
Happy to do so. So this is a presentation that Dr. Emerald Phillips and I put together, and predominantly her, and I made some changes, but there are a few things I think when we think about this that if you're going to be really sound forage and livestock managers, that you're going to integrate that forage management with sound animal management practices. And that includes things such as vaccines, providing mineral supplements, thinking about parasite fly control, all those things that come along with it. But a lot of times we like playing with the animals, but we forget we got to manage the forage along with it. And so we spend a lot of time in this class talking about forages and not so much on the livestock side, because most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about the forage side. And we want to do this because we want it to be efficient and ultimately a profitable enterprise, because if it's not profitable, then you won't be in it for a long period of time. And we only have a bank account that goes so far before somebody says it's time to change what we're doing. So Dr. Smith mentioned this a little bit in his presentation about this first concept that we want to cover. And it's the relationship between kind of maturity and digestibility of forages. So in this kind of figure here, you've got basically going from left to right, immature, really vegetative forage, getting up here into the reproductive stage where the forage has become really mature. It's always going to be more digestible, higher quality when it's in that immature vegetative state. And as it goes up through kind of this boot stage is right before the seed head and grasses comes out, or this bud stage on some of our clovers, we're still got good quality, but it's beginning to decline a little bit. Also, I want you to notice, look at this quote-unquote leaf to stem ratio, particularly on your legumes. Down here you don't have a lot of stem and you got good leaf surface area, right? So the leaves are really high in quality, highly digestible. The stems are going to have more cell wall, more lignin, and less digestible. As we get more mature, we get more stem in relationship to the proportion of leaves, and so naturally that plant's going to be lower in digestibility. The same thing happens in your grasses. In April, when that fescue starts pushing up that flower, you don't see a lot of leaf development anymore. And so it's putting its reserves and its resources into forming that flower for reproduction and seeds. And so you're getting a lot of biomass that becomes stem. And when it gets into late June, that stem is a quality of straw. And so it's not until that plant goes through that mature or that reproductive stage and you've got all this mature biomass up there now, and the hormone goes away that controls or manipulates leaf growth, you start getting leaf development again. So think about that as we're managing this. We can't always stay on top of our forages. Some of it gets away and it will go to reproductive stage, but just appreciate that as it gets to be really mature, digestibility begins to go down, and that's why we like to have rotational grazing, because we kind of force them to graze an area, right? Either force them to graze it or trample it down and restart the clock. And so we're trying to shift some of this forage back over here. All right, factors that impact dry matter intake. DMI is dry matter intake. We'll use that abbreviation a lot. Depends on the maturity of the forage and how quickly it's digested. Ruminants pull in a lot of forage. It goes into a huge fermentation vat, that first compartment of the stomach, which is the rumen. And bacteria then begin breaking that down, as well as when they go lay in the shade and they regurgitate and they chew that forage back up to reduce the particle size. There is a small orifice that leads out of the rumen. And hay that is this long or grass that is this long has to get down to a small enough particle size to pass out of there. And if it doesn't get down to that size, it hangs out in that rumen. And so if I've got really mature forage that takes a long time for particle size to be reduced, then there are pressure sensors or stretch sensors on the rumen that tell the animal that you are full, do not eat. So the faster that particle size breaks down, the faster that forage is digested, the rumen shrinks quicker, and then they say, oh, I can go eat more. So it's a function of intake. Energy intake is the limiting factor in forage-based livestock systems. Okay? Carbohydrate intake. Age and size of animal makes sense, right? A 50-pound lamb is not going to eat as much as a 150-pound ewe. All right? And that's just simple math. Stage of production, dry cows versus lactating cows. A cow that is not lactating doesn't have the metabolic demand on her, and so she doesn't have the metabolic drive to eat as much. And we typically will see dry cows not consuming quite as much as lactating cows. The other reason for that is typically, if you think about our ruminants, lambs or ewes that are maybe carrying 2 or 3 lambs inside. As those lambs get pretty large right before birth, and that uterus is pretty big with those lambs in there, what has it done for the area for the rumen to expand with forages? It's gotten smaller. And so in ewes, it's not uncommon for us to talk about kind of an energy deficiency later in gestation, and we got to think about increasing the plane of nutrition on them so they don't have what? What's that called? Where's my sheep folks? Nobody? All right. So there's the deficiency in energy, and so go back and read up on it and find out what the name of that is, because it's really important in these ewes that you're trying to get twins and triplets out of in that last probably 45 days before they lamb. And a typical recommendation is to feed a really high quality forage at that time, or a supplement with about a ½ pound of grain to overcome that. It's basically ketosis. The animal has to mobilize fat resources, and when they do that, those ketone bodies build up so fast from the fat metabolism that it causes ketosis in those ewes. For beef cattle and stockers, these give you a rough idea of dry matter intake as a % of body weight given different maturities of forages. So if I've got a really mature grass out there, we might expect 1.5 to 2% of body weight. If I had a 1,000-pound bred heifer, then that would mean 15 to 20 pounds of dry matter intake. Okay? For stocker cattle, we typically will see 2% on that lower quality forage, up to 3.5% on really high quality vegetative grass. Maybe something like predominant legume alfalfa mixture. Holstein steers, because of their relationship between their typical frame size, Holsteins are large framed animals, and their visceral mass. And this is a little bit dated because our Angus and other cattle have really gotten more guts in them than they used to have. They're not as tubular as they used to be. But in the older work, we used to always say that Holsteins, because they were deeper and had more capacity for the rumen, they would eat about 1/4% more than what beef animals would. So if I had a 500-pound Holstein steer and a 500-pound beef calf, this dude might eat 2.5%. That Holstein would eat 2.75%. And why is this important? Because I think Adam and all of us that work with kind of folks that are getting in on the beef side and grazing system side, the biggest thing we see is overgrazing, right, Adam? And so Dr. Van Valen went through all that stupid math yesterday, right? That's really not practical. But it's to help you begin thinking about what is my actual carrying capacity. You don't know how many calls we get that I just bought 10 acres and I'm going to live off of this raising 30 cows. It's not going to work, okay? So this is important to understand what these are going to be because of what Chris said, that forage growth isn't constant. It isn't 50 pounds of dry matter per acre per day from March 1 to November 1. Okay, so understanding this relationship will prevent you from having a putting green on June the 1st and wondering why you have no forage on July the 1st. For sheep and dairy cows, they tend to have a higher dry matter intake than beef animals, and we just kind of gave you that chart to run through and think about. Maximal intake comes from high digestibility of the forage, so try to improve your forage management to keep it as vegetative as possible. We mentioned this a while ago that in the spring, when you've got ideal conditions for cool season grass growth, you could probably be rotating every 2 weeks, getting back on that paddock every 2 weeks. Think about your yards. You know, in April, May, when it's really growing fast, you may have to mow twice a week, right? But you get in July, you may not mow but once every 3 weeks. So think about how that relationship exists for your pasture forages that are cool season dominant too. In the summers, you may be 30 to 50 days of rest in between rotations. Start grazing early, but not too early. When I was in Missouri, the fellow that I tenant farmed with, he said, Jeff, once the grass gets up to boot top high, so thinking about where it's getting up to right about your boot, that's about 3 inches, turn them out. Okay? You want to get sufficient growth out there for it to grow, but they've got to have enough grass out there where I like to say that you don't watch the cows walk the fat off of their back. Because if they have to expend an immense amount of energy to go graze and fill that rumen up with 300 pounds of grass every day, then they're expending more energy than they can consume, and you're actually going backwards. So turn them out, but don't be afraid to leave some hay out for them. right? Because they'll go and they'll nip on a few pounds of hay, and that's a great way to get dry matter intake into that rumen, them going and visiting that bale. And the reason we don't want to wait till it's super, super tall to turn out, if I wait till my grass is this tall before I turn out on spring, and I've got 15 paddocks to get through, what's paddock 12 through 15 going to look like by the time I get to it? Yeah, and so that's why we say, well, maybe you just think about doing kind of a couple-day rotation where you go in and you're going fast, so you get back on that before it gets to hay, or you do that. You just say, paddocks 12 through 15, I'm going to designate as hay this year, so I can speed up my rotations to get back here, and then when I get that second growth, I'll bring 12 through 15 back in then. The Q squared concept is it's both quality and quantity. And I will tell you that in my experience, quantity is the number one limiter, and then quality is number two. This chart gives you a rough idea of where maximal intake occurs for sheep and cattle. The dotted line is sheep, the solid line is cattle. And the relationship of forage that's out there on the land. So this is pounds of available forage per acre as we think about going there. So you all were looking at your little rulers yesterday, and you were dialing that up, and you were saying I had 10 inches, and I had 90% coverage or better, so there's 200 to 300 pounds of dry matter per inch, right? You remember that? So maximal intake for beef cattle occurs somewhere around here, right? It's kind of begins to plateau about right here, somewhere in this neighborhood. So we're close to a ton of dry matter per acre. That's where maximal intake will occur. That's 10, 12 inches of forage out there, right? But we also know from the research, and if you look at this curve, where the steep part of this curve begins to bend is right about 11 to 1,200 pounds per acre. And so we will typically see dry matter intake become limiting in beef cattle when it begins to get less than 3 to 4 inches. Because for every bite that they take, they're not getting as much. Does that make sense? So we want to have a minimum of 1,200 pounds, and if you're trying to target maximal dry matter intake, we don't need to be much over about 10 to 12 inches. Grazing time, biting rate, all these things are relatively constant. If we look at eating behaviors in grazing ruminants and beef cattle, we know that they only spend about 8 to 10 hours a day eating. That's it. And so if they can't consume enough in that period of time because it's too short for them to get, then you're sacrificing intake and sacrificing performance, whether that be gain on stockers or milk production on cows, etc. And so we already went through this little point about trying to get in that 1,800 to 2,000, and we're looking at 6 to 10 inches depending on the density of the grass and the combinations that you have out there. Manage your residual heights. We talked just a bit about that. There's this concept that, use half, leave half concept. That doesn't hold true. Don't hold that as a kind of a, this is the way, right? Anybody watch, what is the Mandalorian? This is the way. It doesn't fit everything. If I've got grass crisp that's 3 inches, I don't want to take half, leave half, because then I'm going to be down in the root reserves area on some of those, right? So just think about this, but you'll hear this term thrown out a lot. The real big part of that is making sure that we leave enough residual solar collectors out here for the plant to rapidly come back into photosynthesis, rebuild the reserves that it's going to kind of mobilize to regrow. So if you scalp this, you're taking away all the solar panels, and it's got to use a lot more plant reserves, and so you stress that plant more and you increase the risk of grazing it out. So this whole concept is just trying to say make sure you leave enough leaf residue for photosynthesis. Don't leave the animals on there too long. It's really tempting, Chris, in a year like this, we're going to get rain next week. I'm just going to hold them on this pasture another week. We're going to get rain, and that way when we get rain, those next fields will be ready to go, right? And the longer you leave them out there in a drought, what happens to the grass? It gets worse, it gets more damaged, it gets more trampled, and so don't start feeding hay too late is my point. Utilizing rates of 50 to 60% are not uncommon when we think about how much we can take off at a given point in time. So that's kind of a goal. Oh, great. I thought I had about 5. Oh, no, you're good. I'm going to try and get through this real quick. Step 2, stage of production influences nutritional needs. This is really important just to think about. In a lot of our herds, you've got maybe some dry cows and some milk cows and some sheep together. Just know that each stage of production influences what they need. Milk production is going to be the highest nutritional need for any of our ruminants, particularly about, in beef cattle, it's about 6 to 8 weeks after they calve. Ewes is going to be a little bit earlier when they hit peak milk production, and that's their highest nutritional need in the entire production year. So first 3 months after calving are the greatest nutritional needs for lactating cows. The mid-period, that mid-third of gestation in a beef cow, she's typically going to be drying off. We'll wean the calf. And the fetus is relatively small, and that's where she usually has her lowest nutritional needs in the production year. The last third of gestation, she's dry, but fetal development rapidly increases, and also she's preparing her udder for that next calving. And so udder development will occur and colostrum will form, and this is also why it's important in ewes to make sure that we don't have an issue with ketosis when they're carrying multiple lambs, because that fetal development is very, very rapid that last third of trimester. Beef cattle, it's about the last 60 days. They can be gaining a third to half a pound a day. The fetus will grow inside the cow. High level of production means greater nutritional needs. If I want my stockers to perform at 2 pounds a day plus, then I have to provide them a higher plane of nutrition than if I say, well, I just want to rough these heifers through and develop them, and I've got plenty of time. They don't need to gain more than a pound and a quarter. So again, what is presented to the animal in these systems, energy usually limits performance. And so if I've got a group of stockers that I know that have to meet 800 pounds by the 1st of November, then I've got to keep my performance up to ensure they're going to make that rate. Cows that have the genetic potential to milk 25 pounds need a higher plane of nutrition than cows that only have the genetic potential to milk 15 pounds. Concept 3, cattle are selective grazers. So if you just turn them out on the entire field, they're going to eat what they like, and they'll come back to those same areas and eat what they like and eventually graze that out. So in rotational grazing, we're trying to minimize that selectivity. And so what we're trying to do is force them to graze everything out there, the broccoli and the steak. And so we're forcing them to try to graze it more uniformly. And what that then does is we remove all the clover and the grass, hopefully as uniform as we can, so that the fescue that's got a little coarser leaf blades like Dr. Smith showed you, when they come back to that plant hasn't gotten this tall now, and those leaves have gotten a little more coarse, and they don't want to graze it. So we're trying to keep it all as vegetative as we can. They will avoid dead material. And so you see all this little dead stuff that's in here at the base of the plant. They will not typically graze that unless it's the last thing they got. And I did some research on that 20 plus years ago, and they select against dead material. So just be aware of that in some of our managed systems. If we let grass get too far ahead of us, until it's an extreme situation and that's all they got to eat, they don't prefer to eat that. There's not a lot of soluble sugars left in it, Chris. There's not a lot of soluble nitrogen left in it.
Could you comment on sometimes I work in our rotational stocking systems, Jeff, that we're managing for that 10 inches of forage in that's fine as long as it's raining.
Exactly.
And then if all of our pastures are 10 inches and it stops raining, then we seem like, well, some of that lower quality forage would be beneficial to have as far as getting those animals through that drought period.
It's a really good point, because we talk about stockpiling in the fall for winter grazing, but there's nothing that says that we can't stockpile spring growth for later summer growth, right? And that's a tool that we don't really think about. When we move in late May and a lot of this grass is getting somewhat mature, and you're really tempted to get that brush hog out there, you can get it out there and clip it off, or you can let it go and then manage it to graze it in that July, August. You can do that. There's some challenges with that with other things like weeds that maybe you want to get clipped off. Pink eye, because you've got these big stems there now that are going to cause some abrasion on the eyes. So there's these things that we have to think about from the other management perspective. But I'm with you, Chris. Don't overlook this opportunity to keep a couple fields stockpiled that may be more mature than what you would like to have, but it's biomass, and like they say, it's better than a snowball. So they will graze it. Performance will go down, but you don't have to start pulling in hay or other supplements. The other thing with just real quick.
Can I ask a quick question? So along the same lines, is there a magic, taking all the grasses we typically have in our pastures here in this Kentucky area, is there kind of a magic zone? Because it's almost kind of like you're finding a maximum height of your grasses and then not letting it dip down below a certain height. And so you're kind of managing a little roller coaster there. So
Yep.
if I'm going to look at my fields and go, all right, that's too high, I'm going to get a lot of weeds, I'm going to get ironweed, I'm going to get goldenrods, you know, is there, it sounds like maybe managing your fields 10 to 4, somewhere in there, but I guess in order, if I could turn my cattle loose into the perfect height of grass height.
Take a look at your grazing stick. Who's got a grazing stick?
So when I was in Missouri, again, this fellow had been farming his entire life. And he said, Jeff, turn in at boot top high, take out it when it's just at the tip of your toe. So you think about it, if you wear normal work boots, boot top high is going to be about right here, right?
Yeah.
So Chris, grab your grazing stick.
Look at that.
So there's a start and stop here on the red, right? So if I get here, lo and behold, look at where start and stop end up being. Start is right in this area, right at boot top high. Okay, so you are right. It's that 10 to 4 inch kind of range is kind of that sweet spot. But it doesn't mean every paddock has to be that way.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm in this stage where I'm growing my herd. I've got more pasture than I do cows. So I'm bush hogging to try to maintain pasture and not let it turn into forest. And I'm spending a lot of time on a tractor. So I'm trying to look at a particular field and say, do I want to cut it down to, okay, it sounds like just boot height.
Oh,
Do
yep.
you understand what I'm
I do understand. So I'm not a huge proponent of going in and if in that situation, if you're going to clip, you know, think about your time, think about the fuel use, and that even with pink eye control and stems. In my opinion, and this is Lehmkuhler's opinion, the worst thing you can do is clip that forage at about 8 to 10 inches, because now I've left really a dagger, right? You are better off to drop it down to 4 inches and sacrifice some growth, because if it is up here at 8 inches, that cow wants to get to the leafy green stuff down below it, so her head goes right down there and those stems poke her right in the eyes, and it causes a, so go ahead and clip it down to like 4 inches and get those rough stems down.
Got it. And then I could let it grow out more towards the boot height
Yep.
stage and then put the cattle in.
Yep.
So we didn't mention this, and I know we're getting off topic, but our predominant cool season grass is tall fescue and orchard grass. And bluegrass have one shot of reproductive growth per year. So that's in the spring, so it's going to get a seed head with those stems on it. After that, regrowth is going to be vegetative. So when we clip it down to 4 inches for most of our cool season grasses, that regrowth will be vegetative.
So clipping in late May is going to take care of those stems of the cool season grasses. I mean, you don't want to keep clipping it 4 inches if it's a predominant cool season pasture, because that's going to make it really hard when it gets into late summer and dry conditions. But late May, you still almost always have good regrowth conditions to come back.
And a general recommendation is in August to go out and clip those fields to get your ironweed and that under control, and to reset those pastures for hopeful rain and fall growth, so that's going to be all vegetative at that point too. So good questions. And there are exceptions to the rule. Yesterday I seen some seed heads out on some fescue, but those are probably what, Chris, plants that grew from seeds this year?
Yeah, so I can't explain it, but there's a small percentage of fescue tillers that will go reproductive later in the season. I'm just thinking about something that you said when you were asking Jeff that question, and that's, you've got more pasture than you know what to do with right now because you're trying to grow your herd. I mean, there may be an opportunity there for some stocker cattle on that to help you control that growth and convert that growth into something that you can sell. And that's something Jeff or Kevin LaRon could talk to you about, opportunities to enhance your farm income.
Yeah, or leasing it, or contract grazing for somebody else, because cattle are, you know, that 400 pounder is going to be $1,300 right now. So maybe you can work out a deal with a neighbor or something to contract graze some animals to take advantage of that. All right, I'm about out of time, so I'm going to real quickly just understand that when we look at this leaf to stem ratio issue and different forage types. As you incorporate legumes into your systems, it will increase intake because of greater digestibility, simply because of this leaf to stem ratio in some of these legumes that are much higher in quality and faster to be broken down and degraded in the rumen than grasses. So we like to try to always think about incorporating legumes, not just from the solution to pollution is dilution on fescue and the red clover benefits on the fighting in the fight issues, but also from this factor right here. So it's a multiple approach, or multiple reason why we should try to have an approach to keep legumes in the stand. All right, real quick, they'll go through this a whole lot more, but just understand the growth pattern of cool season grasses. And when we've got these low periods of production, forage is going to be limiting. So how do you plan for that and mitigate that? And so one way to do that is to incorporate some fields that have some of these other forages that they'll show you out in the field later today to try and fill in these forage gaps. So warm seasons like Bermuda, we've got warm season annuals like sorghum, Sudan, pearl millet, etc. If you want to get a jump start in the spring, then you need something like oats, rye, triticale, something like that. Oats typically won't survive our winters here, but wheat and triticale are a good option for those. And that's pretty much it. So try to keep your forages where it at least covers the nose of the animals, and you won't have limits. Pretty simple. All right, thanks, Chris. I'll be around till about 11. I've got to go to Eastern Kentucky to weigh off some yaks on a project over there, but I'll be around this morning.